So I hear that you are interested in tackling your first vintage sweater and you want to make sure that you have a good place to start and you want to knit one that fits, or maybe you've tackled some but they haven't really gone all that well, or maybe you're someone who started like me, who was online, maybe in some place like Etsy, found a very cute vintage pattern. It was a digital download, less than $2, so you just hit buy now, downloaded the file, and were bombarded with overwhelming things, with yarn that was discontinued so you had no idea how much yarn you had to buy, needle sizes that didn't really make any sense to you, construction notes that, again, I had zero context for because I had only ever knit modern patterns, and sizing that, while I'm lucky I do fit into the sizing range because I'm a bust size 36-38, I do have a long torso, so I was going to have to make adjustments to any vintage pattern that I saw anyway. Well, today I want to talk through some strategies that I would recommend someone who is maybe new to knitting vintage patterns but wants to learn how to, or has attempted to but doesn't really feel super happy or confident with it, and give you some levels to think about how to knit them and where to start. Or maybe you've gotten to a certain place and you want to level it up from that point so you can dive right in. One of the things about vintage patterns that I think a lot of people will comment on is that they are not always very size inclusive. What I will commonly see is that vintage patterns are written for size ranges around 32 to 36, maybe 38, so 32, 34, 36 inch bust sizes. I'm depending on different factors, somewhere between a 36, 38. So what I tend to do is I tend to knit a size 36 with bigger needles, and then I make the torso longer and make a few other adjustments to make the pattern fit me. But that is not always feasible when you're more than 1 or 2 bust sizes different from what the pattern is written for. You need to make far more adjustments for something like that to fit you. And especially if you are someone who hasn't even really knit a modern sweater pattern, making those adjustments is asking a lot of someone. So where do you even start? And my first suggestion would be to start with some sweater designers who have taken the time to take some vintage patterns or vintage inspired patterns and write them up in modern ways. There are a few designers that I can think of. The first one that comes to mind that I have really loved the look of is Squid School of Vintage Knitting. I think a lot of her patterns are on Patreon. I didn't get a chance to say hello. If she ever comes across this, I wish that I got the opportunity, but I did see her one year at the New York Sheep and Wool Festival in Rhinebeck, and she looked absolutely stunning in her vintage knitwear. But her patterns are fabulous. They are size inclusive. They are written to modern terms with modern yarn, modern knitting needles, modern instructions. So this is a great place. All of these designers that I'm going to mention are a great place to start because there is a far lower learning curve to going into it, because you can start from a place where you're still learning the vintage construction techniques and the vintage construction styles and the way that vintage garments are made, without the extra hurdles of learning how to translate certain things like yarn yardage and needle sizes and gauge differences and shoulder different, all of that kind of stuff. So a lot of that has been done for you, and you can step in at a much lower level of like information fire hose coming at you. So that's a wonderful pattern designer. Another one that comes up often is Susan Crawford. What I really enjoy about this pattern designer is that she takes literal vintage patterns, and what's been mentioned to me and what I saw as well is that what I always call the rainbow sweater, because that's how it was introduced to me, is one of the very, like, I think of vintage sweater and I think of the rainbow sweater often, and she's taken that and made it in a full range of sizes. I think you have to buy an entire book in order to get that one, but she's also made that in size inclusive sizing. But the patterns are written, again, to understand vintage construction. What do I mean by vintage construction? I think a lot of modern patterns, and I do knit modern patterns, they are knit in the round, top down. I find that's very like Scandinavian style in a way, and you don't set in any sleeves, you don't do much seaming. It's all kind of all in one. Vintage knitwear is most of the time, or very often, knit flat. You knit it in pieces and then you're expected to sew it together. So these are all kind of different techniques than if you would have done it in modern knitting. And I think that these patterns allow you to practice those bits of techniques that you might not have done before in modern knitting, but you don't have to, like I have mentioned before, you don't have to do the sizing or the understanding of how much yarn you need either. You've got a lot of that work figured out for you, and you can practice those bits of the technique that might be new to you without having to do everything all at once that's new to you. Another pattern designer that I enjoy who does vintage inspired knits, but is a little bit more 50s oriented, so Squid School of Vintage Knitting and Susan Crawford I feel lean a little bit more 40s, sometimes 30s. Tasha Could Make That leans a little bit more 50s. They are vintage inspired. I haven't seen exact one-to-one copies in her pattern designs, but they are also size inclusive to modern terms, but with vintage construction. So those are also great patterns to practice. But if you prefer more 50s-ish pattern designs, those are also wonderful ones to look at. I'll plug mine a little bit in there, which is the Mon cardigan. That construction isn't fully vintage, so I don't know if you would find that very helpful to practice that. Claude from Retro Claude also has a few patterns out there from the 30s and 40s, and hers are free, I believe. So those are also some other ones, and she's graded them to a few different sizes as well. All right, but what if you are at the point where you feel pretty confident with some of the vintage terminology, with some of the vintage construction techniques, and you really want to sink your teeth into sizing a pattern to fit you specifically, especially a vintage pattern to fit you specifically, and figuring out some of these vintage yarns and yardage estimates and things like that. So if you are ready to sink your teeth into a resizing challenge, to resize a vintage pattern to fit you and your measurements perfectly, then can I suggest a knit along that was posted by Tasha Could Make That over 10 years ago now. I will post the links to everything down in my description below. This is not sponsored, or she doesn't even know that I'm doing this. It's just that I have very much always admired this post and I have used it a lot myself. I haven't done this exact knit along, but I have used her resizing and her yarn calculation estimates. If you're very, very new to resizing, I would recommend following along exactly with this sweater knit along, even if you don't particularly love the sweater. Oh, also the link to the sweater pattern is broken. It is a free sweater pattern, but the original site is down. But I found a way to kind of go back using the Wayback Machine and resurrect it. So I will post a resurrected link to the free pattern for those of you who want to retry that yourself. I would highly recommend knitting this particular blouse, this particular sweater, including all the calculations and going through the entire knit along step by step, if that's not something that you're willing to invest your time in, because I know it is time and money in investing in the yarn to buy it, and not everyone has the luxury like I do to spend all day every day knitting, so deciding to knit a sweater could be a months long investment of your time. At least I would recommend sitting down with a pen and paper or a spreadsheet and going through those calculations for yourself and understanding how that resizing is done, and understanding how the yarn calculation is done, and understanding how those needle sizes are translated, because vintage needle sizing is different from modern needle sizing. Depends on if you're in the UK, if you're in the US, if it's a wooden needle, if it's a steel needle, if it's double pointed needles. There are charts available online, but I think that Tasha goes through in so much beautiful, minute detail every last thing that I would ever want to consider for resizing a vintage blouse like that. I'll also link a second post that she did for how she worked through a particular cabled knit pattern. She doesn't link the original pattern itself, but it also kind of goes through her thoughts on how she resizes and reworks a cable knit pattern. So that helps to see someone else's thoughts on what they do and the exact steps that they take to customize a vintage sweater pattern to fit themselves. And if I were to fully start over, and if I were to talk to myself again, me from 6 years ago when I first got into knitting up vintage sweater patterns, I would tell myself to first try out a pattern from Squid School of Vintage Knitting, Tasha Could Make That, or Susan Crawford. Go through every single post on Tasha Could Make That's knit along on resizing and reworking a vintage pattern to fit you. I would strongly encourage myself to knit it up, although to be honest, I know myself, I probably wouldn't have, because I would probably have had a vintage sweater pattern in mind that I really wanted to work up. And if that were the case, if I were sitting there in hand with a sweater pattern, a vintage sweater pattern, and I said, I really want to knit this, but I don't know how to do it, I don't know where to start, what do I do? Then this next section is what I would tell myself. If you've arrived at this point because you took the slow, measured approach and you have worked on a resized pattern to get the construction of vintage garments down, then you worked through the knit along from Tasha Could Make That to understand exactly how to resize vintage patterns to work for yourself, and how all of the different aspects of vintage patterns can be reworked and recreated in today's knitting world. And now you're finally sitting here with your own vintage pattern that you want to remake. You are way more patient and disciplined than I ever was when I started my vintage knitting journey, because I just decided to dive right in when I had a vintage sweater pattern and try to figure it out from the deep end. So you're in good company if you joined me in that same fashion. So if you arrived here from the measured approach, then you should have most of the tools in your arsenal to tackle, I would say, at least 90 to 95% of the vintage sweaters that come your way, to resize them and to rework them and to find appropriate yarn and needles from modern selections to knit them up in a way that should fit you and you would hopefully be happy with and be happy wearing. If that's not how you arrived at this section and you are more like me and did not take the measured approach, then what I will leave down in the description are a few things. So first, I'll leave some links to knitting needle conversion charts that I use often so that you have an idea for what sort of needle size you should start with. I don't often use exactly the ones that are listed in the pattern charts because I'm trying to hit, I will admit my knitting gauge is often pretty off from what's listed, so I have to go up or down needle sizes sometimes, but it gives a good starting range. The next thing to talk about is how do you match vintage yarns when you don't even know what is used or where to start? Like, how do you know, number one, how much to use, and number two, what yarn, what modern yarn is even close to the equivalent? I will say a lot of vintage sweaters like these kinds of weight sweaters, they're fingering weight sweaters in US terms, fingering weight sweaters. Very close to 7 to 8 stitches an inch. So if you look for something that's fingering weight, that is very close to what you're looking for. So a lot of times they will list how many balls of a particular yarn that you'll need. And what I'll do is that a lot of times if you look on Ravelry, or if you look online and you just search up that particular yarn, you can see advertisements for them, or if, like I said, if you're lucky, you can see on Ravelry the yardage per ounce or gram listed, which gives you an idea based on the number of balls needed, and then yards per gram, and then grams per ball, how many yards were needed for that size. And say, for example, I am trying to knit a size 36 and I needed 5 balls and it was 100 yards per ball. I need 500 yards of fingering weight yarn, but I know that I have a long torso, so I'm always going to need to knit longer, and I typically want to knit one needle size up. I would probably order at least 10 to 20% more yarn, just as a little bit of an estimate. There are also some estimators out there that you can get, some yarn calculators out there that you can get for different size estimates, things like that. So I would recommend maybe looking those up. I can't be quite as exact. I would say go back to Tasha Could Make That knit along because she has yardage estimators as part of that. That's a better calculator. I personally am lucky because I tend to fall into that like very upper range. I can usually get away with that size. It's tight sometimes, but I can usually get away with it. So I know that not everyone can get away with that as much as I can, but if you want to just jump into the pattern, then I would say base it off of what's listed in terms of yardage required. Yarn required is usually fingering, but again, look at a lot of times that vintage yarn you can find on Ravelry, and that'll give you a lot of hints as to what weight yarn it is, how much yardage per weight it is, and then you can figure out a little bit what modern yarn equivalent you need for that. And you might have to do some work for yardage equivalent for your particular size. In terms of resizing, for me personally, the most important measurements are circumference at the waist and circumference at the bust, which I take to be just about at the underarm. So right at the point where right before we start to go in for the armholes. And so I will take the stitch count right at the cast on and right at the point where we're decreasing for the armholes, divide it by the gauge and see what the stitches in inch are. I don't usually like to have my sweaters to be more than an inch in negative ease. I prefer to have 0 negative ease, maybe an inch positive ease, although with my vintage patterns, no negative ease is usually more of the fit that they're going for, maybe even a little bit of negative ease. They like it to be a little bit more figure hugging sometimes. And that helps me see in general if that particular pattern, the way that it's written, is going to fit me at that size that it's written for. If I see that it is going to be like closer to 2 inches of negative ease, I will try to see if rather than at 8 stitches an inch, if maybe at 7 stitches an inch, it'll get me closer to the size that I'm looking for. If that's not the case, then I'll try to see if maybe I do, one more repeat. So for example, if I wanted to re-knit this pattern, what does one repeat here look like for me? And if I knit one more repeat on the front and one more repeat on the back, will that get me the size that I need that would fit me in the ease that I'm looking for? So small modifications help a little bit, but again, I'm lucky because I'm not too far off usually from the largest size listed in a pattern. If you're more than a size or 2 away from the size listed in a pattern, I would recommend going through all of the steps listed in the knit along for grading the whole range of sizes for you specifically. So you might have to sit down with an Excel spreadsheet, but I promise you that upfront effort is worth it because you'll be happy after you spend that amount of time hand knitting something that'll actually fit you and you'll enjoy wearing versus knitting something and spending weeks and months on it and not being happy with the way that it came out. So yes, it might take some time up front, but hopefully at the end and the result that you wear, you'll be very pleased with it. Which is something that I have to often remind myself of. And also, yes, this is one of the sweaters that we voted on to see if I would write it up as a pattern and grade it so that hopefully others can knit this without having to put the work in for grading it themselves. And Whitney, my pattern editor, if you're watching this, I know I'm very behind on submitting my grading to you. I am so sorry. It took a little bit longer than I was expecting, but I promise I'll get it to you as soon as possible. I'm so excited. I'm working on this one and I'm working on the green wrap sweater. The vote was so close, I've decided to write up both and I'm really excited. I'm hoping to get both out soon to my tech editor, Whitney, and we can hopefully get the test knit started after we get the kinks out. Because I think that the more vintage patterns exist in wider ranges of sizing, the lower the hurdle is for more people to knit really cute vintage sweaters and maybe have the confidence to start knitting and regrading their own if they want to, though I fully understand that not everyone has the time or interest in doing so. So if I can do that instead, I'm more than happy to. So please do let me know. Are you knitting some vintage sweaters? Has this given you the confidence to maybe start trying your hand at knitting some vintage sweaters? And if so, please share some of the ones that you're working on. I would love to see the patterns that you're looking into. I love discovering new vintage sweater patterns. I literally spend hours looking at them sometimes. So please share them with me. Thank you again so much for joining me. If you want to watch more videos like this, I will leave one right here that I think that you might enjoy. And I hope to see you again really, really soon, or maybe here, or maybe next time. Thanks again for watching. I really appreciate that you decided to spend some of your precious time with me. Bye.